"Sir, could you pretend to be my husband just for one day?" That's what a desperate 18-year-old girl cries out in the middle of a dusty frontier street. Laughed at for her size, cornered by a cruel storekeeper, she grabs the hand of a silent Amish stranger. The church bell tolls, the crowd freezes, and in that moment, the lie becomes her only chance to survive. But as the ranch debts close in and the law demands proof, this simple act of desperation spirals into something far bigger. The stranger carries secrets of his own past heartbreak, a vow before God, and now both their futures hang by a thread. Thunder rolls over the valley, hooves pound down the trail, and betrayal lurks in the courthouse halls. A marriage made in a whisper may be the only thing strong enough to save her mother's land and her dignity. But what happens when the truth collides with the landhearts must choose between mercy and survival? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Colorado street as Mabel Carter hurried along, clutching her small sack of flour. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, praying she could make it home without incident. The worn boards of the sidewalk creaked beneath her feet as she quickened her pace. Well, if it ain't the biggest drain on credit in all of Colorado territory. Mr. Rudd's voice boomed across the street, stopping Mabel in her tracks. The storekeeper emerged from his shop, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "Your PA's debts ain't going nowhere, Miss Carter, and neither is that flour till you settle up." Mabel's cheeks burned as townsfolk began to gather. She heard snickers and whispers, saw the pointing fingers from the corner of her eye. The flour sack trembled in her grip as Mr. Rudd advanced toward her, his boots kicking up little clouds of dust. "Reckon we could work something out," he sneered, letting his eyes rove over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "Though ain't no man in his right mind would take you, even to clear them debts." More laughter rippled through the growing crowd. Tears pricked at Mabel's eyes as she backed away, but Mr. Rudd kept coming. The wall of the mercantile pressed against her back, leaving her nowhere to go. That's when she saw him, a tall stranger in plain black clothes, stepping down from a wagon. His broad-brimmed hat marked him as Amish, and something in his steady bearing sparked a desperate hope in Mabel's chest. Without thinking, she darted toward him. "Sir," she blurted, her voice quavering, "could you pretend to be my husband just for one day?" The stranger's deep-set eyes studied her tear-stained face. A hush fell over the crowd as they waited for his response. Mabel's heart seemed to stop beating in that endless moment. Then, with deliberate grace, the tall man nodded. He stepped forward and gently took her trembling hand in his large, calloused one. "Friends," he addressed the crowd, his voice quiet but carrying clear authority. "I would appreciate if you'd show proper respect to my wife." The gears died in people's throats. Mr. Rudd's face darkened as he took in the stranger's impressive height and the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from him. The Amish man's presence somehow filled the street, though he'd barely raised his voice above a conversational tone. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," the stranger continued, fixing Mr. Rudd with a steady gaze. "I am Henry Miller." Mr. Rudd opened his mouth, then closed it again. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that their entertainment had been cut short. Mabel felt Henry's hand squeeze hers reassuringly as he guided her away from the mercantile. They walked in silence toward the edge of town, where her father's ranch house stood weathered and alone against the backdrop of prairie grass. The peeling paint showed gray beneath the faded white, and one of the porch steps had rotted through. Mabel felt shame heat her cheeks anew as they approached the rundown building, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing for the state of the house or for dragging him into her troubles. "I shouldn't have put you in such a position, Mr. Miller." "Henry," he corrected gently, "and thou need not apologize. Sometimes the Lord puts us where we're needed most." His simple words brought fresh tears to Mabel's eyes, but these were different from the ones of humiliation she'd shed in town. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had shown her real kindness. They reached the front porch, and Mabel's steps slowed. She knew what waited inside her father's empty bottles. Maybe even her father himself, if he'd made it home from his latest gambling spree. But Henry's steady presence beside her gave her strength she didn't know she had. Standing there in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, Mabel realized she'd have to explain everything to this stranger who'd shown such unexpected mercy. She owed him that much, at least. But for now, she just held on to the comfort of his quiet support as they faced the worn front door. "Together, thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's response was simple but sincere. "The Lord guides our steps." Even when the path seems unclear, the porch boards creaked beneath them as they stood there, two unlikely allies brought together by desperate circumstances. While the Colorado wind whispered through the prairie grass beyond the yard, the front door groaned as Mabel pushed it open, revealing the dim interior of the ranch house. The smell of stale whiskey hit her before she saw her father slumped at the kitchen table, an empty bottle by his elbow. Her stomach clenched at the sight. "What's this?" her father demanded, his bloodshot eyes fixing on Henry. "Bringing strangers home now ain't enough trouble you've caused." His words slurred together as he pushed himself upright, swaying slightly. Henry stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading daylight that filtered through grimy windows. "Sir, I am Henry Miller." His voice remained steady and respectful despite the hostile welcome. "I have come to ensure your daughter's safety and well-being." Her father let out a harsh laugh that made Mabel flinch. "Safety? That what she told you?" He stabbed a finger in Mabel's direction. Girls always been full of shameful tricks, trying to trap some poor fool into taking her off my hands. I reckon Mabel's cheeks burned with humiliation, but before she could speak, Henry moved closer to her father. With gentle firmness, he placed a steady hand on the older man's shoulder. "A husband's duty is to provide safety and respect for his family," Henry said quietly. "Your daughter deserves no less." Something in Henry's calm authority seemed to penetrate her father's drunken haze. He blinked, looking between them with confusion. Mabel felt strength flowing into her from Henry's presence. She straightened her shoulders and met her father's bleary gaze. "I won't be mocked anymore, Pa," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not by you, not by anyone in town." Her father's face darkened. "You ungrateful, I will stay," Henry interrupted firmly, "until matters of debt and dignity are properly addressed." The declaration hung in the air between them. Her father stared at Henry for a long moment, then shoved his chair back with a screech against the wooden floor. "Ain't staying here to listen to this nonsense," he muttered, stumbling toward the door. "Got business in town?" They watched in silence as he lurched down the porch steps and toward the road leading back to town. When his figure had disappeared into the gathering dusk, Mabel's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she whispered, moving to light the oil lamp on the kitchen table. "Let me fix you some supper. It's not much, but any meal shared in kindness is a feast," Henry replied simply. Removing his hat and settling into a chair, Mabel busied herself at the cook stove, grateful for the familiar routine of preparing beans and cornbread. The lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls as she worked, occasionally stealing glances at her unexpected protector. His presence filled the shabby kitchen with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. When she placed the modest meal before him, Henry bowed his head in silent prayer before taking a bite. "This is good," he said sincerely, and Mabel felt warmth spread through her chest at the simple praise. They ate in somewhat awkward silence until Mabel gathered her courage to ask, "Are you staying long in these parts?" Henry carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering, "I am passing through, seeking land to homestead." He paused, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "But when I heard your plea today, I could not turn away. The Lord sometimes places us where we are needed." The lamplight caught the gentle concern in his expression, and Mabel had to look away from its intensity. "You've already done more than enough," she said softly. "I can never repay such kindness. True kindness asks no payment," Henry replied. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "With your permission, I will sleep in the barn tonight. It would not be proper otherwise." Mabel nodded, grateful for his consideration of her reputation. "Thank you," she whispered. For everything, Henry inclined his head respectfully. "Rest well, Mabel Carter. Tomorrow we shall see what can be done about your situation." He moved toward the door, then turned back briefly. The Lord watches over his children, even in their darkest hours. Mabel watched through the window as his tall figure crossed the yard to the barn, his shadow stretching long in the last rays of sunset. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. Hope. The morning sun crept over the eastern hills, painting the Colorado sky in gentle brushstrokes of pink and gold. Mabel stepped onto her worn porch, a steaming tin cup of coffee in each hand. The crisp dawn air carried the scent of fresh-cut wood, drawing her attention to where Henry worked at the broken fence line. His tall form moved with practiced grace as he secured a new rail in place. Even from a distance, she could see the precise care in each motion. The quiet skill that seemed to flow naturally from his strong hands. The sight of someone tending to her mother's land with such respect made her heart swell with an unfamiliar feeling pride. Henry looked up as she approached, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Good morning, Mabel," he said, accepting the offered coffee with a grateful nod. Before she could respond, the drumming of hoofbeats cut through the morning quiet. Mr. Rudd appeared on his glossy bay horse, his fancy store clothes standing out against the weathered landscape. A smirk twisted his thin lips as he reined his mount to a stop. "Well, ain't this a touching scene?" he drawled, his eyes moving between them with calculated malice. The fake husband, playing at being useful, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew an official-looking paper. "But I reckon this might spoil your little charade." He tossed the document toward them. Henry caught it before it could touch the dirt, unfolding it with careful fingers. His face remained calm as he read, but Mabel saw his jaw tighten. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "County notice, Miss Carter. Says right there, 'less a legal husband's name gets properly filed on the register by week's end. This here property reverts to cover outstanding debts." He leaned forward in his saddle. "And we both know your PA's got plenty of those." Mabel's legs went weak. Her mother's ranch, the only home she'd ever known, could be lost in a matter of days. She watched Henry's eyes move methodically across the paper, studying every word with intense focus. "The law's demands are quite specific," Henry said quietly. His German accent, more pronounced than his concentration, Rudd straightened, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "Indeed, they are. Might want to start packing, Miss Carter? This land'll be mine come Saturday." He wheeled his horse around, tossing one last smirk over his shoulder before cantering away as his horse disappeared around the bend. Mabel's composure crumbled. "Please," she whispered, turning to Henry with desperate eyes. "I know I have no right to ask more of you, but this ranch, it's all I have left of my mother." She worked herself to the bone, keeping it going after PA started drinking. Her hands trembled as she gripped Henry's sleeve. Would you consider extending our pretense? Just for the week." Henry's face reflected the struggle within. His Amish upbringing had instilled deep convictions about honesty. Any form of deception went against everything he believed. But when he looked down at Mabel's trembling hands clutching his sleeve, saw the raw fear in her eyes, something shifted in his expression. "I will remain until this is settled," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. 1 week, if God allows. Tears spilled down Mabel's cheeks as relief flooded through her. "Thank you," she breathed. "I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." "Come," Henry said, changing the subject with characteristic practicality. "There is much work to be done, and I could use your help with the morning chores." They made their way to the barn, where a young calf needed tending. Henry demonstrated how to approach the nervous animal, his movements slow and deliberate. "Like this," he said, showing her how to position herself. "Speak softly. Let him know you mean no harm." Mabel followed his example, surprised when the usually stubborn calf allowed her to steady it. "I never knew they could be so gentle," she said wonderingly. "All God's creatures respond to patience and kindness," Henry replied, watching her success with quiet approval. "Even the most difficult ones just need to know they're safe." Something about his words touched a tender place in Mabel's heart, and she found herself blinking back fresh tears. Together, they continued with the morning's tasks, falling into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The weight of Rudd's threat still loomed, but with Henry's steady presence beside her, Mabel felt stronger than she had in years. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Henry was already at the well when Mabel stepped out onto the back porch, her arms dusted with flour from kneading the morning's bread dough. She watched as he hauled up another bucket, his strong arms making the work look effortless. The wooden bucket emerged dripping, full to the brim with clear water that caught the early sunlight. "My mother used to say good well water was worth more than gold out here," Mabel said. Wiping her hands on her apron, Henry set the bucket down carefully. "She sounds like a wise woman. Would you tell me about her?" Mabel's hands stilled on her apron. No one had asked about her mother in months. "She took sick last winter," she began softly. Worked right up until she couldn't stand anymore. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I reckon it was more than that. Her heart just got tired of watching Pa gamble away everything she built. Henry listened quietly as they walked back to the house together. In my community, he offered, we believe hard work honors both God and family. Your mother understood this truth. Inside the kitchen, Mabel shaped the bread dough into loaves, while Henry described life in his Pennsylvania Amish settlement. He spoke of barn raisings where the whole community gathered, of singing hymns while working the fields, of simple meals shared in gratitude. But you left, Mabel said gently. Not wanting to pry, but curious, Henry's eyes grew distant. Sometimes God's path leads us away from what we know. There was heartache and questions I needed to answer for myself. They worked through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. When the barn door needed fixing, Henry showed Mabel how to brace it properly while he realigned the hinges. She surprised him by knowing exactly how to secure the rope they needed. That's a proper boleyn knot, he said, admiring her handiwork, strong enough to hold through any storm. Mabel felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. Ma taught me, said a ranch woman needs to know her knots as well as any man. For the first time in months, she felt truly useful, like her mother's daughter again. As evening approached, they heard horses in the yard. Mabel's heart jumped when she recognized Reverend Thompson's buggy. The elderly pastor had served the community for 20 years, and his kind face showed genuine curiosity as he approached the house. Miss Carter, he called out warmly, then corrected himself. Or should I say Mrs. Miller now? News travels fast in our little town. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she made the introduction. Reverend Thompson, this is my husband, Henry Miller. Henry stepped forward, offering a respectful handshake. Sir. The pastor's eyes were keen but kind as he studied them both. Marriage is a blessed state, he said carefully. Though I must mention that Joshua Werner, our county clerk, is quite particular about proper documentation. He takes his record-keeping very seriously. After sharing a cup of coffee and offering a blessing for their union, Reverend Thompson took his leave. Mabel stood at the window watching his buggy disappear into the gathering dusk, her heart heavy. I feel like such a fraud, she whispered, lying to a man of God. Henry came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. My heart is troubled too, he admitted, but I believe God sees our true intent. We seek to protect, not deceive. Mabel turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Do you really believe that? I must, he said softly. Otherwise I could not stay. But perhaps we could pray together, ask for guidance. Mabel nodded, and Henry lit the lamp on the table between them. Its gentle light created a small circle of warmth in the deepening darkness. They bowed their heads, and Henry's voice rose quiet but clear in the simple words of grace he'd learned as a child. Dear Lord, guide our steps on this uncertain path. Help us to honor truth while protecting those in need. Grant us wisdom to know your will. Amen, Mabel whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. It was the first time they'd prayed together, and something about the shared moment felt more intimate than any conversation they'd had. Outside, a chorus of coyotes began their nightly song, their wild voices echoing across the prairie. Mabel shivered slightly, suddenly aware of how vast the darkness was beyond their little pool of lamplight. How many threats lurked in the shadows. But here, in this moment of shared prayer and quiet understanding, she felt safer than she had in months. Henry seemed to read her thoughts. The world may seem fragile when night falls, he said, but we are not alone in facing it. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds as Henry led Mabel's ancient mule from the barn. The creature's ears twitched with stubborn reluctance, but Henry's gentle hands and soft words soon had him. Standing quietly for the harness, Old Jack ain't been hitched proper in months, Mabel said, watching Henry's skilled movements. Pa usually just ties rope around him any which way. Henry adjusted the leather straps with care. A well-fitted harness shows respect for God's creatures, he said, checking each buckle. Your mule will work better if he's comfortable. They climbed onto the wagon's wooden seat, its boards worn smooth by years of use. As Henry clucked to Jack, Mabel gripped the seat's edge. Already dreading the town's reaction to their appearance together, the morning air grew warmer as they approached the cluster of buildings that made up the heart of town. Already, women were sweeping their boardwalk storefronts. and men gathered around the telegraph office smoking their morning pipes. As the wagon rolled past, conversations halted. Heads turned. "Look at that," came a stage whisper. The big Carter girl caught herself an Amish man. "Heard he's just passing through." Another voice added, "Won't last a week." Mabel's cheeks burned. She hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. Beside her, Henry sat straight and calm, as if the whispers were merely wind in the grass. His steadiness helped her lift her chin a fraction higher. The wagon creaked to a stop before Rudd's Mercantile. Henry stepped down first, then offered Mabel his hand with simple courtesy. Through the store's windows, she could see Mr. Rudd watching them with narrowed eyes. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. Mr. Rudd's voice cut through the quiet store like a whip. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple, come to add more to your credit, Miss Carter." Several customers turned to stare. Mabel felt herself shrinking again. But Henry's voice rang out clear and firm. "Good morning, Mr. Rudd. We require seed corn and garden seeds. We will pay in full." Rudd's smile turned cruel. "Pay in full, will you? And I suppose you're truly her husband, come to settle all accounts." Henry met the storekeeper's gaze steadily. From his pocket, he drew out carefully counted coins. "I am here to conduct honest business. Nothing more, nothing less. The seeds, if you please." The simplicity of his words, backed by the solid presence of actual payment, seemed to deflate Rudd's bluster. He gathered their order in silence, while his customers watched with interest. When he named the price, Henry counted out exact change on the counter. "Thank you," Henry said plainly. "God's peace be with you." Mabel followed him out, aware of the whispers now taking on a different tone. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Rudd so effectively, and with such quiet dignity. The ride home started in contemplative silence. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice soft with memory. "Back in Pennsylvania, there was a girl," he began, "Rachel Yoder. We were meant to marry." He paused, adjusting the reins in his work-roughened hands. "But she chose another, Jacob Stoltzfus, a good man, better suited to stay in the community. I couldn't bear to watch their happiness, knowing I had failed to be what she needed." Mabel listened, her heart aching for the pain she heard beneath his measured words. "That must have been powerful hard," she said softly. Henry nodded. "I left seeking God's purpose elsewhere. But sometimes I wonder if I was running from shame instead of toward truth, his." Honesty touched something deep in Mabel's soul. This man who had shown such strength in town was willing to share his weakness with her. It made her feel seen in a way she hadn't since her mother died. Back at the ranch, they worked side by side in the freshly turned earth. Henry showed her how to space the seeds properly, his large hands demonstrating the right depth for planting. The sun tracked across the sky as they moved down the rows together. As twilight approached, Mabel reached for another handful of seeds. Her fingers brushed against Henry's calloused palm. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a shiver of awareness through her. Their eyes met in the fading light, then quickly looked away. Mabel studied her dirt-streaked hands, the blisters forming from honest work. For the first time in months, she felt like more than just her father's burden. Here, planting new life in her mother's soil beside this quiet man, she felt the first stirring of possibility. Sunlight dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through Mabel's bedroom window. She stood before her mother's old mirror, fingers trembling as she smoothed the faded calico dress she'd found in a trunk. The fabric still held a trace of her mother's lavender sachet, bringing tears to her eyes. The dress was snug, but she'd managed to let out the seams just enough. Her reflection showed a woman trying hard to be presentable, though her hands kept fidgeting with the worn fabric. From outside came the distant toll of church bells, their bronze voices rolling across the valley. Henry waited by the front door, dressed in his plain black Amish coat and hat. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, and a gentle smile touched his face. "You look lovely," he said simply. Mabel blushed, unused to compliments. "It was Mama's," she whispered. "I hope it's not too tight." "It suits you well," Henry replied, offering his arm. They walked together toward the white-painted church that stood sentinel at the edge of town. Other families were already making their way inside, their Sunday best catching the morning light. Heads turned as Mabel and Henry approached. She could hear the whispers start. "Did you see?" The Carter girl, that Amish fellow, Henry's arm remained steady under her grip as they climbed the wooden steps. Inside, they found a pew near the back, but there was no hiding from the curious glances cast their way. Mabel tried to make herself smaller, a habit born of years of judgment. The service began with familiar hymns. Then Reverend Matthews took his place behind the pulpit, his kind eyes scanning the congregation before settling on Mabel and Henry. His sermon text came from Psalms. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Mabel's hand found Henry's arm again, gripping it tightly. Each word seemed meant for her, speaking to the lonely years of mockery and shame. Henry's warmth beside her felt like an anchor in a storm of emotion. After the final prayer, the congregation moved to the social hall for the weekly gathering. Usually, Mabel would have slipped away, but Henry's presence gave her courage to stay. Ladies set out plates of cornbread and sweet cakes, while men pushed benches against the walls to clear space for dancing. "Miss Carter," Reverend Matthews called out, "would you favor us with a song? I remember your mother's beautiful voice in our choir." Mabel froze, panic rising in her throat, but Henry's hand found the small of her back, steadying her. She looked up into his earnest face and found strength there, walking to the front of the room on shaking legs. Mabel closed her eyes. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice, teaching her the old hymn Amazing Grace on quiet evenings by the fire. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing. Her voice emerged soft at first, then gained strength with each note. The simple melody carried all her heart's longing for acceptance, all her gratitude for recent kindness. The room fell silent, conversations forgotten as her clear tones filled the air. When the last note faded, Mabel opened her eyes to see several women dabbing at tears. Henry stood near the back, his face full of wonder. For the first time in years, the looks directed her way held admiration instead of scorn. The fiddler, old Mr. Jenkins, broke the spell by striking up a lively tune. Couples began to move to the center of the room. Henry approached Mabel, his hand extended in invitation. "I'm not much for dancing," he admitted with a small smile, "but would you teach me?" Mabel hesitated. "I'm not very graceful," she warned. "Then we shall learn together," Henry said. Their first steps were awkward, both trying not to tread on the other's feet. But gradually they found their rhythm, turning slowly among the other couples. Henry's hand was warm and sure at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Mabel, surprising them both. Henry's answering chuckle merged with hers, creating a private moment of joy in the crowded room. For one shining hour, she forgot about whispers and judgment. She was simply a young woman dancing with a kind man, her heart light with possibility. Her heart light with possibility. That evening, kneeling beside her bed in the quiet darkness, Mabel pressed her hands together in prayer. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you for showing me I might be worth something after all." A tear slipped down her cheek, but for once it was born of gratitude rather than shame. Through her window, she could see Henry's lantern moving in the barn as he finished the evening chores. Its gentle glow seemed to echo the warm hope growing in her heart. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Mabel and Henry's wagon rattled down the dirt road. The morning's joy from church still lingered in Mabel's heart, making the bumpy ride feel almost pleasant. Henry hummed one of the hymns under his breath, his deep voice mixing with the creak of wagon wheels. Their peace shattered as they approached the ranch house. Mabel's father stood waiting on the porch, his face twisted with anger. Empty bottles lay scattered at his feet, telling the story of his morning. "So here comes the happy couple," he sneered as they pulled up, "parading around town, making me look like some weak fool who can't handle his own flesh and blood." Mabel's hands trembled as she gripped her skirts. "Papa, please don't papa me," he roared, stumbling down the steps. "This stranger walks into my house, acts like he owns the place, and you expect me to just bow down?" Henry helped Mabel down from the wagon, then turned to face her father. His voice remained steady. "Sir, I mean no disrespect to you or your authority." "Disrespect?" Her father's laugh was harsh. "You're living a lie with my daughter. Making me look like I can't provide, you haven't provided." Mabel burst out, surprising herself with her volume. "Mama's gone, the ranch is failing, and all you do is drink and gamble." Her father's face went purple. He lurched forward, fists clenched. "You ungrateful?" Henry stepped between them, his tall frame blocking Mabel from her father's advance. "I will not fight you," he said calmly, "but I will not allow harm to come to your daughter." Her father spat on the ground. "Fine, take her. Take the whole worthless ranch. I'm done fighting for it. Let the county have it all." He turned and staggered toward his horse, nearly missing the stirrup as he mounted. "Papa, where are you going?" Mabel called out, but he just kicked his horse into a trot, heading toward town without looking back. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Mabel and Henry stood in the yard, watching dust settle in her father's wake. Mabel's legs felt weak, and tears burned her eyes. "Come," Henry said gently. "Let's see to the mule first." In the barn, the familiar tasks of unharnessing and brushing down the animal helped steady Mabel's nerves. Henry worked beside her, his movements sure and practiced. The mule's soft breathing and the scratch of currycombs filled the silence between them. Later in the kitchen, Mabel warmed up leftover beans and cornbread. Neither felt much like eating, but Henry insisted they keep up their strength. Rain began to fall outside, pattering against the tin roof. "I should have done something more," Henry said suddenly, setting down his fork. "But I cannot raise my fists, even when mocked or threatened. It cost me dear friends back home who said I was too soft." Mabel studied his face in the lamplight. "What happened?" "A neighbor accused me of stealing his sheep. Others joined in the accusations. I would not fight to defend my honor, only spoke truth. Some saw it as weakness." He smiled sadly. "But violence solves nothing. It only breeds more pain." Understanding dawned in Mabel's heart. Here was a different kind of strength, not in muscle or threat, but in unwavering conviction. She thought of how he had faced down Mr. Rudd and her father, never raising his voice or his hands, yet standing firm as a mountain. Lightning flashed, followed by booming thunder that rattled the windows. Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a small, well-worn Bible. "May I?" he asked. When Mabel nodded, he opened to a familiar passage and began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The ancient words of Psalm 23 filled the kitchen, carrying more comfort than Mabel had expected. Despite her father's threats, despite the uncertain future of the ranch, peace settled over her like a warm blanket. Henry's voice, steady and sure, anchored her against the storm's fury outside. The long day's emotions began to weigh on Mabel. Her eyes grew heavy as she rested her head on her crossed arms at the table. The last thing she remembered was Henry's voice continuing to read by lamplight, keeping watch as she drifted into exhausted sleep. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed by the night's storm. Puddles reflected the pale sky, and the creek that bordered Mabel's property roared with muddy spring runoff. Henry stood on the back porch, coffee cup in hand, surveying the damage. "The south fence is half under water," Mabel said, joining him with her own steaming cup. "Mama always said that creek had a mind of its own during storms." Henry nodded gravely. "We'd best check the posts before any cattle wander off. I saw some spare lumber in the barn we can use." They worked through the morning hours, wading through wet grass to reach the damaged sections. The creek had torn several fence posts loose, leaving gaps where cattle could easily escape. Henry showed Mabel how to test each post's stability, teaching her to recognize when wood had rotted from the inside. "Like people," he mused, tapping a post that looked solid but rang hollow. "Sometimes what shows on the outside ain't what matters most." Mabel wiped sweat from her brow, considering his words. "Reckon that's true enough." She heaved another post into place while Henry tamped down the soil around it. The sun climbed higher as they labored. Despite the hard work, Mabel found herself smiling more than she had in months. Henry's quiet strength and patient teaching made the task feel almost like a dance between them. When he demonstrated how to splice broken rails together, his hands guided hers with gentle assurance. Near midday, exhaustion finally caught up with them. They collapsed in a patch of grass, backs against a sturdy oak tree. Mabel's sides ached from laughing at Henry's story about a stubborn mule back in Pennsylvania. "Never seen a creature so set against wearing a harness," he chuckled. "Reminded me of my younger brother, Samuel, equally hard-headed." "You must miss them," Mabel said softly. "Your family?" "I do." Henry's smile turned wistful. "But sitting here with you, it feels like family, too." The words hung in the air between them, warm as sunshine. Mabel's heart swelled with emotions she dared not name. A telegram rider approached at a gallop, kicking up mud as he reined in his horse. "Message for Miss Carter," he called out, waving a yellow envelope. Mabel's hand shook as she opened it. Her face went pale as she read the words. "The county clerk," she whispered. "He's coming tomorrow to inspect our marriage papers." Henry's expression grew grave. "Mabel, we'll have to sign the registry," she said quickly. "Just this once, just to save the ranch. I cannot." Henry's voice was firm but pained. "I cannot put my name to a lie, even for good reason. But they'll take everything." Mabel's voice rose with panic. "Everything Mama worked for. Everything she left me gone because you won't sign a simple paper." "Simple." Henry stood, his own voice rising uncharacteristically. "You ask me to break my vows before God? There is nothing simple in that. So your vows matter more than my home." Tears spilled down Mabel's cheeks. "More than me? That ain't fair, and you know it." Henry's hands clenched at his sides. "I came here to help you, not to what? To watch me lose everything?" Mabel turned and fled toward the house, shame and fear churning in her stomach. Hours passed in tense silence. Evening settled over the ranch, bringing with it a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Mabel sat by the hearth, staring into the flames when Henry's boots scuffed the floorboards behind her. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I spoke harsh before." Mabel didn't turn around, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. "So did I." Henry settled onto the floor beside her, just far enough away to be proper. "I've been praying on this," he said. "I cannot betray what I believe it would poison everything between us. But I'm asking God to show another way. Mabel's voice caught. "I just wanted to stop being the girl everyone mocks. The burden. When you're here, I feel seen, valued." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "I reckon that's worth more than any ranch." Henry's hand found hers in the firelight. "You are valued, Mabel, not for land or papers, but for who God made you to be." The fire crackled low as they sat together, the warmth of their clasped hands speaking what words could not. "Whatever comes tomorrow," Henry said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I will not leave you alone. That's my promise, before God and you." Mabel squeezed his hand in response, letting the truth of his words wash over her like a blessing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard when two wagons approached the ranch. The first carried the county clerk, a thin man in a dark suit, his leather portfolio clutched tightly. Behind him, Mr. Rudd drove his own wagon, a satisfied smirk already playing across his face. Mabel's hands trembled as she smoothed her best dress. Henry stood beside her on the porch, his presence steady as a mountain. Though he wore simple Amish clothes, his bearing held more dignity than the clerk's fancy suit. "Good morning," Henry called out, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "Welcome to our home." The clerk descended from his wagon, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Miss Carter," he said, pointedly ignoring Henry's greeting. "I'm here to verify your claim of marriage." "As is proper," Henry responded, stepping forward to shake the clerk's hand. The man hesitated before accepting the gesture, clearly uncomfortable with Henry's directness. Rudd lingered by his wagon, calling out, "Best show him those marriage papers quick, girl. Time's wasting." The clerk opened his portfolio, producing official documents. "I'll need to see your marriage certificate, witness signatures, and proof of proper registration." Henry drew himself up to his full height. "Sir, we have no such papers. But I tell you plain our union is real before God Almighty." "Before God?" Rudd barked out a laugh. "That ain't worth the paper. It's not written on." The clerk frowned, scratching notes with his pencil. "Without legal documentation, I cannot verify this claim." "The law requires a commotion from the house," interrupted him. Mabel's father stumbled through the door, reeking of whiskey, despite the early hour. "What's all this fuss?" he slurred, barely keeping his feet. "Mr. Carter," the clerk said sharply, "is your daughter married to this man?" "Married?" Her father swayed, pointing an unsteady finger at Henry. "She ain't married to nobody. Just some Amish fellow showed up, playing pretend." He hiccuped. "My girl's too big for any real husband anyway." Mabel flinched as though struck. Henry's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. "As I suspected," Rudd said, stepping closer. "Nothing but lies from a desperate girl. You'll be off this land by week's end, mark my words." The clerk closed his portfolio with a snap. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter, but I must declare this claim invalid. Without proper documentation and with your father's testimony," he shook his head, "the property will revert to cover outstanding debts as previously arranged." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mabel's feet, All her mother's dreams, all their years of work, gone in a moment of legal ceremony. She heard Rudd's triumphant laugh, as if from a great distance. "God will make a way," Henry whispered, his hand warm on her shoulder. Trust in that, if nothing else. But it was too much. As soon as the wagons pulled away, Mabel fled to the barn, her vision blurred with tears. She collapsed into a pile of fresh hay, great sobs racking her body. This was worse than any mockery. This was losing everything she had left of her mother. Heavy footsteps on wooden planks told her Henry had followed. Without a word, he sat beside her and gathered her into his arms. She buried her face in his shirt, letting out all the fear and shame she'd carried for so long. "I failed her," Mabel choked out between sobs. "Failed Mama's memory." "No," Henry said firmly. "You fought with honor for what's right. That's what matters most." They sat together until Mabel's tears ran dry, the barn growing darker as the sun set. Inside the house, a lonely supper awaited them, beans and cornbread gone cold on the table. Neither had much appetite. The house felt cavernous around them, every creak and settling board a reminder of what would soon be lost. Mabel pushed food around her plate while Henry sat in troubled silence. The ranch that had been her whole world now felt like it was slipping. Through her fingers like water, between them stretched the weight of things unsaid, hope that had bloomed too briefly, dreams of what might have been. The lamp's weak light cast their shadows long against the walls of what would soon no longer be home. The first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon as Henry saddled his horse. Mabel stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself against the morning chill. Neither spoke as he mounted up words, felt too fragile in the growing light. "I'll return before dark," Henry promised, his voice gentle. The horse's hooves kicked up dust as he rode toward the distant army post, becoming smaller and smaller until he disappeared completely. Mabel turned to face the empty house. The day stretched before her like an endless prairie. With mechanical movements, she gathered eggs from the henhouse, her mother's old basket hooked over her arm. 6 brown eggs, barely enough for a proper breakfast. But she had no appetite anyway. The morning passed in a blur of familiar chores. She fed the chickens, mucked out the horse stall, and hauled water from the well. Each task felt hollow without Henry's steady presence beside her. Even the animals seemed to sense the difference. The old milk cow lowing mournfully when Mabel approached with the pale dot. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Mabel paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow. Her mother's voice drifted through her memory like a cooling breeze. "Your worth isn't measured by what others see, child. It's measured by what's in your heart." She touched the worn fence post Henry had mended days ago, remembering how he'd shown her to test the wood for strength. His patient teachings had made her feel capable, not clumsy, valuable, not burdensome. The afternoon dragged on. Mabel swept the porch, darned socks, and checked the garden, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering to dark places. But as evening approached with no sign of Henry, worry gnawed at her belly. What if he'd decided to leave for good? The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. She'd grown used to his quiet strength, his gentle ways. The house felt wrong without him in it. The sun was setting when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Henry's horse appeared first, then the man himself slumped slightly in the saddle. His clothes were covered in dust from the long ride, his face weary beneath his broad-brimmed hat. Mabel hurried to meet him as he dismounted. "You're back," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. Henry nodded, leading his horse to water. "The army officer listened well enough," he said, after a long drink from the dipper, "but he cannot interfere in civil matters. The law is clear on that." Hope flickered in Mabel's chest. "Did you learn anything that might help?" Some. Henry's expression darkened. The officer mentioned rumors about Rudd bribing officials in other land disputes, but without witnesses willing to speak, he shook his head. "It cannot be proven." Mabel's brief hope crumbled like dry earth. She turned toward the house, blinking back tears. "I've kept your supper warm," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Henry caught her arm gently. "Mabel, wait. There's more I need to say." She faced him, heart pounding. The last rays of sunlight caught his honest face, showing every line of concern there. "I spent the whole ride praying," he continued, "asking God to show me the right path between truth and mercy." He drew a deep breath. "I've been torn wanting to help you, but fearing to break my vows against deception. Mabel nodded, remembering their argument about the marriage papers. I know your faith means everything to you. It does. Henry's voice grew softer. But something else has grown to mean just as much. His calloused hand found hers. These past days with you, they've wakened feelings I thought were dead after. After Pennsylvania, Mabel trembled, barely daring to breathe. The lamplight from the house window cast a gentle glow around them. What I mean to say is, Henry's eyes met hers directly. This may have started as pretense, but my caring for you is real as the ground beneath our feet. Mabel's free hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She searched his face for any hint of pity or falsehood, but found only truth there and something warmer, something that made her heart leap like a spring lamb. I never thought, she whispered, someone like you could care for someone like me. Henry's grip on her hand tightened. You are exactly who God made you to be, he said firmly, and that person is precious beyond measure. They stood together in the gathering dusk, the confession hanging between them like a bridge newly built. The land might still be in jeopardy, but something else had been saved, something far more valuable than acres or deeds. Inside, their supper waited on the table, but neither moved to go in just yet. This moment felt too important to break, too delicate to disturb with mundane things like food or chores. In the distance, a whippoorwill called, its song pure and sweet in the evening air. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when wagon wheels rattled up the dusty drive. 3 neighboring families pulled up to the ranch house, faces grim with urgent news. Mabel and Henry emerged from their morning chores to greet them. Sarah Jenkins, whose farm bordered the eastern pasture, spoke first. We just came from town, she said, twisting her apron. That snake Rudd was in his store, bragging to anyone who'd listen about how he's taking over your ranch. Her husband, Thomas, nodded solemnly, said he's already got plans to tear down the house and put up a grain storage facility. Mabel's hands trembled as she clutched the porch rail. He can't, not yet. We still have 2 days before. He was showing off some papers, added Mary Wilson, the baker's wife. Claims he's got everything arranged with the county clerk already. Henry stood very still, his jaw set in a firm line. The quiet strength that usually emanated from him had hardened into something more resolute. I have remained silent too long, he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. This cannot continue. Mabel grabbed his arm, panic rising in her throat. Please, Henry, don't fight him. Violence won't solve anything. Henry covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle despite the anger in his eyes. Not with fists, he assured her, but we must take a stand. He fell quiet for a moment, as if listening for guidance. Then his face brightened with sudden purpose. The preacher, we should call him here, the preacher, Mabel asked, confused. Henry turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. To witness our vows before God, he said softly, it may carry no legal weight, but it would be true in his eyes. Understanding dawned on Mabel's face, followed by a flush of joy. The neighbors murmured approvingly. I'll fetch Reverend Matthews myself, Thomas offered, already climbing back into his wagon. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The women helped Mabel press her mother's wedding dress, while Henry and the men cleared a space by the creek, beneath the old cottonwood tree where Mabel's parents had once exchanged their own vows. As evening approached, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. A small group gathered by the creek, the neighbors, Reverend Matthews, and even a few townspeople who had heard the news and come to show support. Mabel emerged from the house in her mother's dress, the simple cotton calico that somehow looked transformed in the golden light. Henry waited beneath the cottonwood, dressed in his plain black Amish coat, his eyes shining as she approached. The creek bubbled softly behind them as Reverend Matthews opened his Bible. Though this ceremony carries no legal authority, he began, it bears witness to a commitment made before God and this community. Henry took Mabel's hands in his voice was steady and clear as he spoke. I came here seeking land, but found something far more precious. You have taught me that truth lives not just in words, but in actions of the heart. I pledge myself to you, Mabel Carter, as your faithful husband. Tears spilled down Mabel's cheeks as she responded. I never thought to find someone who would see past my appearance to my soul. You've given me dignity when others gave only mockery. I pledge myself to you, Henry Miller, as your loving wife." From his pocket, Henry withdrew something he'd carved that afternoon, a simple wooden ring, smooth and polished. "Like this ring," he said, "our love has no beginning and no end." He slipped it onto her finger, where it fit as if it had always belonged there. Reverend Matthews raised his hands in blessing. "What God has joined in spirit, let no man tear asunder." Though earthly laws may not recognize this union, it is sealed in heaven's sight. The small gathering broke into soft applause and murmured blessings. The creek continued its gentle song, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called to its mate. As the sun settled toward the horizon, Henry and Mabel walked hand in hand back to the house. The wooden ring felt warm against Mabel's skin, more precious than any gold band could ever be. Though Rudd's threat still loomed, though the ranch's fate remained uncertain, something had shifted in the world. They were husband and wife now, if not in the county records, then in the deepest chambers of their hearts. The neighbors drifted away as darkness fell, leaving the newlyweds to cross their threshold together. They paused at the door, both knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them united in faith and love. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of amber when the rumble of wagons shattered the morning peace. Mabel, who had been feeding chickens in the yard, froze at the sight of Rudd leading 3 wagons toward the ranch house. His hired men, rough-looking fellows with weathered faces, carried thick ropes and CROWBARS. Henry emerged from the barn, his quiet steps carrying him to stand beside Mabel. Despite the threat approaching, his voice remained steady. "Go inside, dear wife." Rudd's wagon stopped in a cloud of dust. He climbed down, straightening his vest with a smirk. "Time's up," he announced, loud enough for his voice to carry across the yard. "Clear out now, and we won't have to get rough." Henry walked to the porch steps and stood firm, his tall frame blocking the entrance. Though his clothing was plain and his manner gentle, something in his stance made 2 of the hired men exchange uncertain glances. "This land," Henry declared, his voice carrying across the yard, "is now a household bound under God. We will not be moved by threats or force." Rudd's face reddened. "Your fake marriage won't save you now. I've got the papers right here." He waved a document in the air. "Papers bought with bribes. Rudd." The unexpected voice came from Reverend Matthews, who appeared on the road leading several townsfolk. Among them were the baker, the blacksmith, and Sarah Jenkins from the neighboring farm. The minister's eyes were hard as he approached. "I heard you in the saloon yesterday, bragging about how you paid off officials. These good people heard you too." The gathered townspeople nodded, their faces stern with disapproval. More wagons appeared on the road, bringing other neighbors who had witnessed Mabel and Henry's vows the evening before. Rudd sputtered, but his confidence was cracking. The hired men began backing away, wanting no part in what was unfolding. Sheriff Beecham's voice cut through the tension as he rode up on his bay horse. "Because I've got sworn statements here saying otherwise." He pulled papers from his vest. "This eviction is halted until we have a proper hearing. And Rudd, you'll be answering some questions about those bribes." Mabel, who had been watching from the doorway, rushed down to clutch Henry's arm. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. Henry's strong hand covered hers, steadying her as always. Rudd's face had gone from red to pale. He backed toward his wagon, no longer the strutting bully of moments before. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his threat sounded hollow. "Oh, I reckon it is," the sheriff replied. "Mount up, Rudd. We've got some paperwork to sort out in town." The crowd watched as Rudd and his men retreated, wagon wheels raising dust as they hurried away. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, the neighbors began unloading baskets and boxers from their wagons. "Thought you folks might need a proper celebration," Sarah Jenkins called out, carrying a steaming pot of stew. Others brought fresh bread, pies, and even a ham. The yard that had faced threat of violence just moments before transformed into a gathering of community. Tables appeared from wagons, tablecloths were spread, and the aroma of good food filled the air. Mabel stood in wonder as women who had once whispered about her size now embraced her, calling her Mrs. Miller with genuine warmth. Men who had looked away in embarrassment now shook Henry's hand, clapping him on the shoulder and praising his stand for justice. As the sun began its slow descent, everyone gathered around the makeshift tables. Henry stood, his plain black coat a stark contrast to the colorful gathering, and raised his hands for blessing. "Lord," he prayed, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "we thank thee for this bounty, for this land, and most of all for the gift of community. Bless this food and these friends who have stood for truth, and bless this house, that it may always be a home of welcome and love. Amen, amen," the gathering echoed, and the feast began. Mabel looked around the table at faces that now smiled at her with acceptance instead of mockery. She watched Henry passing plates with quiet dignity, completely at home among their neighbors. The house behind them, once a place of shame and loneliness, glowed with lamplight and laughter. For the first time since her mother's passing, the ranch felt truly like home. Henry caught her eye across the table and smiled, his love for her clear in his gentle gaze. She smiled back, her heart full of gratitude for this man who had started as a stranger and become her protector, her husband and her home. Her husband and her home. A week passed like a slow-moving stream, each day bringing them closer to the hearing. The courthouse, a stern brick building in the heart of town, buzzed with anticipation as townsfolk filed in that bright morning before the hearing. Reverend Matthews had joined Henry and Mabel in his study, performing a proper marriage ceremony. Mabel wore her mother's lace collar, and Henry stood tall in his clean black coat. Their I-do's rang with quiet certainty, making official what their hearts had known for days. Now, in the packed courthouse, Henry and Mabel sat side by side on the wooden bench. Judge Peterson, his gray beard neatly trimmed, called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. Sarah Jenkins described overhearing Rudd's drunken boasting about bribing officials. The telegraph operator testified to seeing money change hands behind the mercantile. Through it all, Rudd's face grew redder, his confident smirk fading to a scowl. When Mabel's turn came, she spoke clearly about her mother's legacy and her right to the land. Her voice trembled only once when she described Henry's kindness in her darkest hour. Henry's testimony followed, plain and honest as always. He admitted their unusual beginning, but spoke of God's hand in bringing them together. Judge Peterson listened, his weathered hands folded on the bench. When the last witness stepped down, he cleared his throat. "The evidence of corruption is clear," he declared. "This court finds in favor of Henry and Mabel Miller. The ranch shall remain theirs. Their marriage is recognized as lawful, and Mr. Rudd will face charges for his attempts at fraud." The courthouse erupted in cheers. Rudd stormed out, shoving past onlookers. Within the hour, word spread that he'd ordered his store closed and his wagon packed. Henry helped Mabel into their wagon for the ride home. She sat tall beside him, no longer shrinking from curious eyes. Neighbors waved from porches and fences as they passed, calling out congratulations. Evening found their home bright with lamplight and fellowship. Sarah Jenkins brought her famous apple pie, while the blacksmith's wife arrived with fresh bread, still warm from the oven. Laughter and conversation filled the rooms that had known too much silence as Mabel moved among their guests. Serving coffee in her mother's cups, she felt a familiar presence, as if her mother's spirit blessed this new chapter. Henry appeared at her side, his strong fingers finding hers. "Now we begin," he whispered, and Mabel squeezed his hand in return. Knowing at last she was truly home, golden rays pierced the morning mist as dawn crept over the Colorado mountains. Henry and Mabel Miller rose with the sun, as had become their cherished routine. The early autumn air carried a crisp sweetness that made their morning chores feel like a blessing rather than a burden. Mabel gathered eggs from the henhouse while Henry milked their new cow, a wedding gift from neighbors. Their movements flowed together now, practiced and comfortable, like a dance they'd known forever, instead of mere weeks, breakfasts, near ready. Mabel called through the kitchen window, the smell of fresh biscuits wafting across the yard. Henry smiled, remembering how she'd once been too shy to raise her voice above a whisper. By 8 o'clock, the sound of wagon wheels announced the arrival of their morning visitors. 3 children from the Peterson farm and 2 more from the Wilsons' place tumbled out, clutching worn primers and slate boards. Their eager faces lit up at the sight of fresh milk and honey on Mabel's kitchen table. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," they chorused, and Mabel's heart swelled at the respect in their voices. She'd started teaching them letters 2 weeks ago, after noticing how far they lived from the town school. What began as a kindness had blossomed into a daily joy. Outside, Henry's axe rang steady against the chopping block. His clear voice lifted in amazing grace. the hymn carrying across the yard as he worked. The children joined in from their lessons, their young voices mixing with his deep one. Mabel paused in her teaching to watch him through the window. His shoulders moved with confident strength, so different from the uncertain stranger who'd stepped off that wagon months ago. He caught her eye and tipped his hat, making her blush like a girl dot. As evening approached and the children headed home, Henry and Mabel settled onto the porch with bowls of beef stew. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, while crickets began their evening chorus. Sometimes Mabel said softly, "I still can't believe how much has changed." That day in town, when Mr. Rudd was mocking me, she shook her head, remembering the shame that had once seemed permanent. Henry reached for her hand, his palm warm against hers. "I never once regretted saying yes," he assured her. "God's hand was in it all along. Even when we almost lost everything, especially then, his thumb traced her wooden wedding ring, carved with tiny hearts. That's when I knew I loved you truly." Not just from duty, fireflies began rising from the tall grass, their lights dancing like earthbound stars. The evening air carried the sweet scent of late summer flowers Mabel had planted along the path. Together, they bowed their heads. Henry's prayer rose quiet but firm. "Lord, we thank you for this home, this land, and the love you've granted us. Guide our steps as we build a life of welcome here." Mabel's soft amen mingled with the evening breeze. Their ranch, once a place of loneliness and fear, now glowed with warmth and possibility. The lights from neighboring farms twinkled in the distance, no longer reminders of isolation, but beacons of friendship and community. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.